Hello everyone and welcome back. So today we're going to be covering a relatively short topic. This is the ecology of communities. Now remember, ecology refers to how species interact with other individuals of the same species, different species, as well as their environment. So we're going to look at how an entire community of organisms affects, interacts with itself, interacts with others, interacts with the environment. So let's jump in. Now, biological communities is several species, i.e. two or more, that occur at any particular locality. Now, we characterize the community by first as richness, i.e. the number of species present. So if something has high species richness, it has high numbers of species present, as well as primary productivity, which is the amount of energy that is physically produced. Now, the interactions among members govern many of the ecological and evolutionary processes that we're going to speak about today. Now, we can look at a classical example here of the Nambian grasslands, where we have a Nambian community here, where we have birds and large mammals, and the stuff living in the water, and all these things, different species coming together, living in the same area of Namibia. That is a community. Now, we have a couple of definitions to go over first. Now, the first is going to be an ecotone, which is sometimes defined, but commonly defined as places where the environment changes abruptly. But it's also defined, but also sometimes defined as the abundance of a species in a community that does not change geographically in a synchronous pattern. Now, species abundance is just simply referring to how much of a species there is. So in this case, we can look at what we call a moisture gradient, where it's very, very wet or very, very dry. And this is all along the Santa Catalina Mountains of southeastern Arizona, where each line represents an abundance of a different tree species. You notice that green species is really abundant where it's wet and goes away, and then it becomes abundant when it's dry. You can see species here in yellows, kind of variable abundance as well. This species in purple only is really abundant in dry areas. So species abundance does vary as well. And community composition varies as well, where we have a normal soil, an ecotone, or a serpentine soil, where we can see these different species here different in their presence along them. So i.e. the community composition here is comprised of these groups of species, community composition here is comprised of these species, community composition here is comprised of these species. So community composition, i.e. what species are present, does vary as well. Now this leads us to developing what we call an ecological niche. Now the niche, or a niche, I prefer niche, so that's what I'm going to say, is the total of all the ways an organism uses the resources in its environment. And these include space utilization, food consumption, temperature range, the appropriate conditions for mating, as well as requirements for moisture and more. Now, an ecological niche inherently leads to what we call competition, i.e. two species of the same species or two different species competing for a specific resource. Now we have interspecific competition, where when two species attempt to use the same resources and there's not enough resource to satisfy both. We also have interference competition, where the physical interactions over access to resources, as well as exploitive competition, where they consume the same resources. Now, there's three different types there's two distinct types of niches. First is the fundamental niche, which is the entire niche that a species is capable of using based upon the physiological tolerance limits and resource needs. And then the realized niche, which is the actual set of environmental conditions, presence or absence of all of other species, which the species can establish a stable population. So this is what it's capable of doing. This is what it actually does. And there are other causes of niche restriction as well, including predator, presence or absence, or the absence of pollinators. But again, a niche is all what they can do. Now we can look at an example here where we have barnacles, so our handy dandy little organisms here, two distinct species. So we have Semibalanus and Thalanthamalis, I believe that's how you say that. And we have the high tide line and the low tide line. And we can see that the realized niche for our Semibalanus is here, whereas its fundamental niche is actually the same. Now you can look at our friend here in Thalamus here. Its actual realized niche is only here, but its actually fundamental niche is all the way down here. Now, why is that the case? Well, as you can see here in the figure here, what's keeping this organism from going down to its full actual fundamental niche is actually the presence of this other species. So the competition between these two species keeps our Thalamus here from actually physically realizing its entire niche, and its actual niche is a bit different than its actual fundamental niche. So competition is actually kind of an important aspect here. So this leads us to competitive exclusion, where two species are competing for a limited resource. The species that uses the resource more efficiently will eventually eliminate the other locally. Now, there's a classical experiment from G.F. Goss where they use competition using 3 species of Paramecium. So let's look at this experiment. It's a pretty cool experiment. So 3 Paramecium, Caudatum, Auralia, and Bersania, where they have the population density. In the absence of absence of one another, they grow as such, again, with nothing else present. And then you look at their population density when you put them together, and you'll see that the population density of these 2 species grows, and then the red one eventually dies out. And then you can see the example here where the red one grows, and the green one is limited by its population. And again, you can see it's very different here, and very different here, very different here, and very different here. Now, why is that? Again, competition. This organism here in yellow is displacing the one in red, thus leading to this one being driven lower into the population or eventually extinct locally. Whereas this one here, it's growing, but still limiting the capacity of this organism as well. So pretty cool little experiment here by Goss. But what Goss really was putting forth is this really sort of other interesting idea, which we call resource partitioning. Now, we're actually going to talk about this in a different case. We're actually going to talk about it by sympatric, or lizards living on the same exact area. So these are anoles. They're pretty cool lizards. But there's been some really amazing work done in the tropics on this group of lizards, where they look at how they divide a resource. Now, the resource in this case is actually a tree. And so we have a resource of the tree, i.e. space and food, the things that come along with it. And you have an organism that's specialized to the canopy, organism that's specialized to the trunk, the organism that's specialized to the base. And they partition this resource depending on their evolutionary adaptations to directly avoid competition. Now, why do they avoid competition? Well, competition is not good, right? Competition is costly. So they've avoided competition by partitioning the resource, and that resource in this case is a tree. Goss also actually showed, and it wasn't really, we didn't really talk about it, but I want to loop back and talk about it for one quick second here, is that in this tank, his Paramecium caudatum and his Paramecium bursaria were actually resource partitioning as well, where this species was taking one resource up, and this species was taking up another resource, thus minimizing competition between them. So we had competition at its maximum here, and then basically no competition here. So again, resource partitioning is pretty cool. Now, resource partitioning is often seen in similar species that occupy the same geographic area, and it is thought to result from processes of natural selection. Now, this does lead us to a really cool thing called character displacement, where differences in morphology between species that share a sympatric region and might play a particular cool role in radiation. So let's look at character displacement in our beloved finches, where we can look at individuals in each class side as a percentage here on the Y, and the finch beak depth length in the X, where we have 2 species, G. fungulinosa and G. fortis, where this species lives only on this island by itself. The species lives only on this island by itself. But when you put them together on San Cristobal and the Florini Islands of the Galapagos, you'll see that they have this character displacement, where they shift. Fulingosa shift to having a smaller beak, whereas Fortis shift to having a larger beak. Again, character displacement, because they're occupying the same space, shifting to use different resources to minimize competition overall. So it's a pretty common thing we see. Now, let's talk about another example of this in our seed-eating rodents as well as kangarooed rats. So there's a really interesting experiment. They set up 50 meter by 50 meter enclosures, and the enclosures had openings large enough for seed-eating rodents, but not enough for the kangarooed rats. And they actually monitored the number of small rodents in the thing. Now, the results actually indicated that the kangarooed rats will actually compete with the other rodents and limit their population size. So this is what we have. You want to take a peek at this on your own time, definitely take a peek at it. But again, we can see the number of captures of other rodents, the kangarooed rats removed, the kangaroo rats present. But again, we can take this really cool look at this experiment. Again, definitely take a peek at it on your own. It's a pretty cool little experiment. We can get some really interesting results about competition from this. Now, another aspect here of competition is a specific type which we call predation. Now, predation, as you guys probably know, is the consumption of one organism by another, and predators and prey and how they interact with one another strongly influences prey populations. So we can look at a case of Paramecium here.